Present screen. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching. For us, it's good evening. Today, I'm going to be presenting the Columbian Exchange as part of my project for my History 580 class. So we begin with just a general outlook, which is that the Columbian Exchange radically reshaped the global economy by creating interconnected trade routes that transfer not only goods, but also labor, wealth, cultures. And this transfer sparked economic transformations that had lasting effects on Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So basically everywhere except Antarctica. So we begin with systematic changes. So we're going to focus on four, even though I put there four major shifts in systems, those being economic, social, environmental, and cultural, with a bonus story at the end. So we begin with economic, which focuses on reshaping Europe, silver, slave labor, and the plantation economy. So the economic systems that emerged from the Columbian Exchange were profoundly, if not primarily, shaped by silver. So particularly its extraction from Potosí in Bolivia, which was discovered in 1545. So according to Charles C. Mann, who I will be quoting for about most of this presentation, Potosí was producing 60% of the whole world's silver, 60% of it, from a single mountain in a single town, with over 45,000 metric tons being extracted by 1800 and tons of that silver. So all of that silver, tons, physical tons, were extracted by indigenous slaves in mines like this one in the picture that were riddled with vaporized mercury, sulfur, arsenic, and silica like powder, which can lacerate your lungs if you inhale it. And these indigenous slaves had to climb in and out of this hell on a ladder made out of leather, with heavy, heavy silver that was about like 60 pounds each. And this silver didn't stay in the Americas or Spain for very long, or even mainly, but rather it flowed into a global economy, mainly China. So China's demand for silver was immense because by the late 16th century, silver had become the backbone of China's monetary system, following centuries and centuries of failed coinage policy. And much of the silver mined in the Americas crossed the Pacific to China, with Mann estimating that over half of the silver extracted in the New World ended up in Chinese markets. And this trade was central to the Manila Galleon trade, where silver was exchanged for Chinese goods such as silk and porcelain, which was produced in like crazy mass, like akin to what we experience now. Quote, merchants sold this silk in Manila, which is in the Philippines, making profits of 30, 40%. And then Spanish merchants would buy that and then double or triple or even quadruple the price. And they still sold their goods in America for a third of the cost of just regular Spanish textiles. That's how many Chinese textiles were in the market. Chinese silk that was sent from China through the Pacific to the Americas and then to Spain, so it crossed two oceans, was still cheaper than Spanish silk produced in Spain. So this is the beginning of mercantilism and a sign of early capitalism. And this influx of silver into Europe triggered the price revolution, which basic prices for goods was rising as much as 300% between like a 100-year period. So what we just experienced in the States was like, I think it got up to like 15% and we reeled from it. So imagine 300%. And Spain's over-reliance on silver led to their economic decline when the silver production waned. And then in China, there were similar inflation jumps, and both empires had like really outdated tax policy. So they didn't adjust it accordingly, and their revenues like dropped. And this contributed to the weakening of both of these empires. And the global demand for silver drove labor exploitation in the Americas. Mann highlights the brutal conditions under which the indigenous people were forced to work in the mines under the encomienda system, with 8 million dying in the mines by 1600. And the silver economy also fueled the transatlantic slave trade, as enslaved Africans were forced to work on the plantations, producing sugar and tobacco, completing the triangular trade, which is the Americas produce raw material for Europe that Europe turns into finished goods, which they sell to Africans, who then take other Africans as slaves and then send them over to the Americas to produce that raw material. And that was the triangular trade. So silver wasn't the only product exchange, it was just incredibly impactful. Agricultural products also played an equally transformative role, particularly maize, which is corn, potatoes, and sugarcane. And these New World crops, it wasn't really a new world, but I'm going to use that term here. These New World crops were transplanted into Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they transformed all of these societies' agricultural practices and diets worldwide. In Europe, the potatoes became a staple crop, significantly contributing to the population boom of the 17th and 18th centuries due to their high caloric yield and adaptability to terrain. And sugarcane, introduced from the Old World into the Americas, became a central crop in the Caribbean, a cash crop that they never really used, but they would sell as like a commodity in Europe. And the rise of these sugar plantations in the Caribbean further intensified European colonial interests. It drove up the demand for enslaved labor from Africa. So a question that I want you guys to just think on as we continue is, how do sugarcane in the Caribbean, potatoes in Europe, and then sweet potato in China compare and connect as we go through this? So from an economic perspective, the development of plantation economies, particularly sugarcane in the Caribbean and tobacco in North America, spurred the growth of mercantilism in Europe. And this economic system focused on accumulating wealth through trade and colonization, and it was central to the development of global commerce. And again, I encourage you to question how European powers use these resources that they extracted from the Americas to reinforce their empires. And a question I'd like for you to also think on is, how did the dependency on enslaved labor create long-term economic and social problems that continue to haunt post-colonial societies and still continue to a degree in the global South? So, on to the next slide, which is social systems. So, the Columbian exchange dramatically restructured social systems across the globe, every part, most notably in the Americas and Africa. These shifts were driven by the movement of people, both voluntary and obligatory, the introduction of new labor systems, the impact of disease, all of which transformed societies on both sides of the Atlantic. And the existing social hierarchies of the indigenous civilizations were dismantled when new hierarchies that were based on race and economic exploitation took their place. So, in his short account of the destruction of the Indies, Bartolomé de la Casa, which is a primary source during this time, provides a detailed documentation of the brutal treatment of the indigenous population by the Spanish from a primary source again. So I'm going to quote him at length. Quote, "The natives were forced to carry their Christian masters in hammocks, slung from the shoulders of the bears. They were treated as beasts of burden, and they developed huge sores on their shoulder and their backs, as what happens with animals that are made to carry excessive loads. And this is not to mention the floggings, the beatings, the thrashings, the punches, curses, and countless other vexations and cruelties to which they were routinely subjected, and to which no chronicle could ever do justice, nor any reader respond, save with horror and disbelief." End quote. He said like a lot more rough and much more vivid and detailed things, but I chose to do that to present you that one because it really encompassed, like in general, the abuses that natives were going through. And at the same time as these abuses, because being abused isn't enough, diseases played the crucial role in reshaping these social systems in the Americas. Charles C. Mann in 1493, he highlights the devastating impact of smallpox, particularly measles and influenza, which swept through the New World and where the New World had about estimated 50 to 100 million people. So these diseases killed about 90% of the indigenous population within the first century of contact. That's like if today, within 100 years within our lifespan, 900 million people died in the Western Hemisphere. That was the equivalent, which is apocalyptic. And that's what happened to these people. And many indigenous communities went extinct without ever having come in contact with a Spaniard, without ever even seeing one, and they went extinct because of the disease that just spread that quickly. And this fed the early settler notion of settling into an empty land. And the sudden disappearing of natives, particularly in North America, who use slash and burn techniques to control and maintain millions of acres of land, when they disappeared, it allowed for the rapid reforestation of these areas, which further fed into the empty land narrative, which then further led into the settlers thinking, oh, I deserve this land. It's empty. It's mine for the taking. And then they abuse the people that are still left there. And the collapse of the indigenous labor system due to disease and overwork created a labor vacuum, leading to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. And the demand for labor in the Americas, particularly for plantations, led to the forced migration of millions of Africans, according to Mintz, over like a 300-year period, over 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the New World, with about 10.7 million surviving the journey of the Middle Passage. So millions just dying on the way to get over here. And of these, 90% of them were taken to the Caribbean and South America to work on the sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations. And these labor systems were based on a very strict racial hierarchy, with Africans and their descendants at the very lowest strata, while European colonists maintained their control over the land, wealth, and political power. And in John McNeill's Mosquito Empires, it discusses how disease shaped these labor systems in another way, because yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes that just decimated European populations in the Caribbean. And the Africans had some resistance to malaria due to their prolonged exposure in Africa. So they were seen as more suitable laborers in the tropical environments, which then just, reinforced them becoming the backbone of these South American economies, instead of it becoming slowly that Europeans would work it too. And the entrenchment of the racialized labor not only supported the economic system of the Americas, but it also solidified the racial hierarchies that would persist for centuries and still kind of persist in the South, in Southern America. And the reshaping of social systems was not confined to the Americas. In Africa, the slave trade had profound consequences, obviously, for the social structure. And the demand for captives fueled the rise of powerful African kingdoms like the kingdom of Dahomey and Ashanti, which participated in the capture and sale of these slaves in exchange for European goods, particularly firearms, which this led to an increase in militarization and social stratification within the African societies themselves. As elites profited from the trade, while the lower classes were increasingly vulnerable to being enslaved. We zoomed in too much. All right. As for like the cultural exchanges, these transnational economic links were not only about money, they created new opportunities for cultural exchanges between distant regions, particularly in agriculture. For the exchange in material, especially in food, chocolate, which was discovered by the Europeans in Mexico with the Aztec and the Maya, quickly became a luxury product in Europe. And it became more than just a food, it became a cultural symbol of wealth and refinement in Europe. When it was before used as a bitter drink, by the priest class in Aztec and Mayan societies. And at the same time, chili peppers, which are native to the Americas, spread from the New World to Europe, Africa, and Asia, and particularly in Asian regions like India, China, Southeast Asia, chili peppers became a deeply integrated aspect of local cuisine, which fundamentally altered food traditions. So today you can't think of Indian food without some form of chili powder or pepper or spice or whatever. And before 1550, before the 1492, that just didn't exist in their culture. It wasn't a part of it. So this global diffusion of cuisine is one of the most tangible examples of cross-cultural interaction during the Columbian exchange. And religious exchanges also played a very critical role in these interactions, particularly in the spread of Christianity. When European powers established colonies in the New World, they brought with them not only soldiers and settlers, but also missionaries, whose goal was to convert the indigenous populations to Christianity. And a little sub-goal was to convert all of China to Christianity, but they didn't succeed over there. So Bartolomé de la Casa provides an important perspective on the process because he initially supported the missionary efforts, but later became a very fierce critic of the violent methods used by the Spanish to impose Christianity on indigenous people. He documents how indigenous spiritual practices were suppressed, temples destroyed, indigenous religious leaders were persecuted, and their wives raped and murdered. And all of this in the name of bringing them into the Catholic fold. So I'd like to quote Bartolomé de la Casa at length with what I think is the most encompassing quote that he gave, which is, quote, "The local people have been presented with an ultimatum. Either they adopt the Christian religion and swear allegiance to the crown of Castile, or they will find themselves faced with military action. It is as though the Son of God, who gave his life for every living soul, when he instructed his followers with the words, 'Go ye therefore and teach all nations,' intended heathens living in peace and tranquility in their own lands to be confronted with a demand that they convert on the spot without ever hearing the word or having Christian doctrine explained to them, and that should they show any reluctance to do so, and to swear allegiance to a king they never heard of, and whose subjects and ambassadors prove to be cruel, pitiless, and bloodthirsty tyrants, that they should immediately surrender all of their worldly goods, lose all of the rights to their land, their freedom, their womenfolk, their children, and their lives. Such a notion is as absurd as it is stupid, and should be treated with the disrespect, scorn, and contempt it so amply deserves." End quote. Very strong feelings. And however, this imposition of Christianity didn't lead to the erasure of indigenous spiritual practices. Instead, what emerged was a form of religious syncretism, where indigenous beliefs blended with Catholic practices. And this wasn't just in the Americas, or this wasn't just with the indigenous people in the Americas. In the Caribbean and Brazil, where the plantation economy relied heavily on enslaved Africans, a similar process occurred. Africans brought with them their religious beliefs and practices, which blended with Catholicism to create syncretic religions like Santeria in Cuba and Candomblé in Brazil. And these religions maintained African spiritual elements while incorporating the saints' prayers and rituals of Catholicism. And the religious life of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean was not passive. So despite the brutal conditions of slavery, the African communities actively preserved their cultural and spiritual traditions, even as they adapted them to their new environment. And this resistance through religion is what allowed African culture to survive, even in the face of overwhelming European dominance. And I zoomed in again. Yep. So the next system is environmental systems. The environmental transformations brought about by the Columbian exchange were as profound as the social and economic change. as European crops, animals, and diseases spread across the Atlantic into the Americas and vice versa, the ecosystems of both of these worlds were radically altered, creating new landscapes and obliterating old ones. Mann's 1493 offers an indispensable lens on the introduction of Old World livestock, particularly one of the most significant and devastating, pigs. Mann vividly described how these pigs, actual pigs, brought to the Caribbean, multiplied at an explosive rate due to the absence of natural predators, and these roaming pigs destroyed native crops, upended carefully maintained indigenous farming systems, and forever altered the balance of the environment. And the rapid multiplication of pigs exemplifies, and like a more general theme, the uncontrolled spread of foreign species and how their introduction had unforeseen ecological consequences. European settlers who were intent on replicating the farming methods that they knew back home cleared vast tracts of land for crops like sugarcane, tobacco, and wheat. And this led to, as Alfred Crosby notes in the Columbian Exchange, it required intensive monoculture farming, which led to deforestation on a massive scale. And in the Caribbean and South America, entire ecosystems were just razed to the ground to make way for plantations. And the damage wasn't just limited to deforestation. The introduction of cattle and sheep contributed to the degradation of just the land through overgrazing, because without proper land management and practices, and paired with the drive to just maximize output, European settlers exhausted the soils. And these transformations were permanent. Decades and even centuries later, the environmental scars are so visible in many regions in the Caribbean and Latin America. However, the environmental shifts weren't only about plants and animals. Diseases previously unknown in the New World found a new ecological home in these disturbed landscapes created by the European agriculture. The clearing of forests combined with the stagnant pools of water left by the European livestock provided a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. And the introduction of Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carried yellow fever, had far-reaching consequences not only for the population, but for just the entire environmental balance. And these environmental impacts, again, were not just confined to the New World. The exchange of crops like potatoes and maize profoundly altered Old World ecosystems. The potato, for example, quickly became a staple across Europe, particularly in places like Ireland and Russia, due to its ability to grow in poor soil and colder climates. And these crops were transformative not only for European diets, but also for their landscapes, as traditional farming practices adapted to incorporate these new high yield plants. Because one potato shoots out 8 potatoes. It's a crazy return. And at the same time, maize was introduced in Africa, which transformed the agricultural practices over there, especially in West Africa. And Mann notes that maize quickly supplanted older crops because of its adaptability and, again, high yield, becoming a cornerstone of African diets and farming systems to this day. However, its introduction also contributed to the rise of certain African kingdoms that engaged in some not so great behavior, because with the surplus of maize, it helped feed the growing labor force that were required to meet European demands in America. And unsurprisingly, perhaps nowhere are these environmental challenges more evident than in the Caribbean, where the plantation economies tied the exploitation of the land directly to the exploitation of the human labor. And the environmental degradation of just planting a single crop, when the indigenous practice, especially in North America, was to plant 3 crops together so that they work together, right? It made a land that was more deadly with diseases that had not been there before. And it shows this intertwining of ecological and social stratification that would go on to reverberate for centuries. So the next one is the little side story I mentioned. So we're going to teach with an object, the sweet potato. Its scientific name being batatas, which is what we call it in Spanish. So the sweet potato is native to the Andes mountain in South America, where it had been cultivated for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. And indigenous people grew sweet potatoes along other staple crops like maize and other potatoes. And Mann notes that this is part of the broader array of New World crops, which provided nutritional diversity in Andean highlands, contributing to the development of complex civilizations like the Inca. And one of the most striking global impacts of the sweet potato was in China. So, an American crop was transported by Spanish and Portuguese merchants to the Philippines, which was then smuggled from Vietnam into China. That's how interconnected we all are through this sweet potato. So by the 16th century, the sweet potato had taken root in the agricultural systems of Asia, and it provided a reliable and calorie-dense food source that would have had a dramatic impact on the region's history. So I want to briefly read for you a story from a footnote, not even like the main part, not even like where the good stuff is, the footnote, which details a smuggling attempt into China at a Vietnamese border. So, quote, according to a 19th century gazetteer, the Chinese doctor Lin Huilan successfully treated a sick Vietnamese princess in 1581. And at a banquet in his honor, he was served sweet potato. And now Vietnam had banned the export of the tuber, this is a tuber, to China on the penalty of death. So if you brought this across state lines, you are getting killed. And the gazetteer recounted, but Lin decided to take some anyway. So while crossing the border, he was questioned by a Vietnamese border official, and Lin answered truthfully, and he required that the officer secretly let him through. And the officer said, as for what happens today, being a servant of this country, it would be disloyal of me to let you pass. However, being grateful for your virtues, to deny you would be unrighteous. And then he killed himself. And then he drowned himself. He was so morally afflicted that he had to serve his country or respect a man who was being honest, that he killed himself. So he drowned himself, and Lin returned to China, and he spread the sweet potato across Guangdong. Imagine killing yourself over a sweet potato. I'm going to move on. So in China, particularly, the sweet potato provided a crucial role in helping to sustain a rapidly growing population. As Mann notes, the sweet potato thrived in areas where traditional Chinese staple crops, such as rice and wheat, struggled to grow. The sweet potato's resilience to poor soils and its ability to grow into less fertile regions of southern China made it a key crop for feeding and expanding the population during the Ming and Qing dynasty. By the 18th century, China was experiencing a significant population growth, which, according to Mann, was due in large part, asterisk, to the introduction of sweet potato and other world crops. Quote, were maize, potatoes, and sweet potatoes entirely responsible for China's population boom? No. But most of the increase took place in areas with American crops. The families that Qing policies encouraged to move west needed to eat, and what they ate day in and day out was maize, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. And part of the reason that China is the world's most populous nation is the Columbian exchange. It no longer is. Now it's India. India is the most populous, but I digress. So Mann highlights how the spread of the sweet potato underscores the global connectivity that emerged during the Columbian exchange. The crop's journey from the Andes to Europe to Asia highlights the complex web of transnational trade, agricultural exchange that tied all of these continents together. And this trade wasn't one way. It reflected a system of global interdependence where crops, people, and goods were constantly in motion across the world's oceans. And the fact that a crop native to South America could become a staple in Asia shows how deeply interconnected global societies became after 1492. Now let's think about the global impact of sweet potato as a case study in cross-cultural interaction. The crop moved from being from one region to another, was adapted to different climates, diets, and in the process became a staple food for millions of people across multiple continents, basically every continent. Its story is a clear illustration of cultural and economic exchanges that were central to the Columbian exchange. And it furthermore demonstrates the biological exchange that underpinned much of the transformation of global history during this period. To teach global history through the object of the sweet potato, we can focus on how this one crop influenced global agricultural systems, created new forms of social organizations, and fostered transcontinental connections. And as students examine the sweet potato, you guys, you're not just looking at a root vegetable. You're exploring the pathways of global trade, the movement of people, goods, and the environmental impacts of crop migration, which I didn't mention because I'm a little tight on time, but a ethnic minority in China who are called the Shak people would live up in the mountains, clear forests on like steep slopes, plant sweet potato, and then take it out. And that process allowed rain to like degrade the soil, which created insane flooding in the lower regions of China, and which damaged the Chinese population. And then those people started planting these crops, which then led to the same thing of soil degradation and on and on and on and on. And this thing right here is emblematic of the larger processes of the Columbian exchange. And it was a driver of demographic growth. It is a catalyst for agricultural change and a symbol for global interactions that transform societies across every continent. Mann's detailed account reminds us that history can often be found in the smallest objects, and through the lens of the sweet potato, we can see how interconnected and interdependent the world became in the centuries following 1492. And now we're going to do a little backflip. And this conclusion is basically what I just said now, except mine was focused on the sweet potato. I wrote this before I got so involved into the vegetable. These are the themes incorporated. These are my sources, and I appreciate your diligent attention. Clap emojis. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Bye. How do I stop recording? I don't